Welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of WORKOLOGY.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of WORKOLOGY.
Globalization and outsourcing have led many U.S.-based organizations to expand their business operations internationally. This has created a need for smaller and faster ways to screen talent, especially in the technology sector. In a near-zero unemployment economy, recruiters and HR leaders know that they must be able to move quickly once a qualified candidate has been identified. And we're looking for support services for screening technologies to be able to hire candidates faster and better, especially when tech isn't our recruiting specialty. I mean, we're HR and recruiting leaders after all, not engineers. Simply considering that most of us aren't trade coders. Otherwise we'd be coding, right? Welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast sponsored by Clear Company. Today I'm joined by Henrik Enstrom. He's the CEO of FutureSkill, a global IT cloud-based recruitment testing company. Henrik, welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's dive right in. Can you talk a little bit about your background as an engineer and how it led you to create testing technologies?
Yeah, I've been interested in development and programming since I was very young. And so I studied computer engineering. Then I started to work as a developer. And I guess my first job I got a bit too easily. I mean, it was just a nice little chat with a recruiter. And then I got to sign the contract and I was supposed to start working. Only later I really, found a better way to do tech recruiting, which was in London when I was also recruiting for a job. And there I could see it was much more mature. This was like 2007 in 2007. And basically all the interviews I got to, they had like a strong screening step. The first recruiters would have some questions maybe on Java over the phone. And then later when I came to the actual interview, they had a senior developer who would kind of test me, doing some coding examples, and would check that I could really do coding in a good way. So I really saw that was a better way to do it as compared to, the first way, which was just a nice little chat and then sign the papers. I knew from my class in university that there were some people who were really good developers and some who were not so strong. And I could see that the London way of doing it was a much better way to see which end of the spectra I was. So I could really see why their way was better. And then, so I was working for different companies like Ericsson and Boeing, when I come back to Gothenburg. And then I also used similar methods of screening candidates using a code test on paper. And then later I started FutureSkill, where we do a web-based version of this, where you can send out code tests to prospective candidates and test them online at home, basically.
I love the story of why this was developed. I think this is really important. And you saw a need, you experienced it yourself. As a developer and engineer, your time is really valuable. You're being sought after by a lot of different organizations. So you want to make the best use of your time in interfacing with that organization, which is why I think your story will resonate with a lot of different people.
Yeah, that might be true. And I mean, it's interesting that also since then in Sweden, when I was going to London, it was not that common to do code testing. But if you look now, it's much more common. So it's been a strong trend that testing candidates, maybe it's more crucial. People have realized that it's something you need to do. And also, I guess if most other companies are doing code tests and you're the company that doesn't do code tests, then you might end up with those that don't do well in tests. That's, of course, a very, very big risk that, I think people are seeing more and more that they're driven to do testing themselves.
What are some trends that you're seeing in technology hiring in your experience in the market? You have a unique point of view in that you're working with clients globally.
Yeah, so one unique challenge is, I think all over the world and certainly in Sweden, in the US, in London, is to find the good talents. Basically, not many people are actively looking for jobs. And developers they know they have a very strong position and they are used to nowadays to not have to apply for jobs, but rather to be contacted by recruiters. They get a lot of messages on LinkedIn and sites like that. And so that's one thing. And even though you have a scarcity of good talents, it's still very important that you don't just hire the first person that you come across, because it's certainly a job where it makes a big difference if you're in the top tier or if you're hiring someone who's further down the line. So that's one unique challenge, basically, to when you have someone who does the interview well, that you still take the time to do some tests and check that the person is a good developer. And I mean, test is not the only way. You can also use references. The best thing maybe is if you know someone who's worked with the person, then you can really make a good assessment of how they are in the workplace. But that is one challenge, to find the talent, and then to, even though it's difficult to find talents, not hire the first person. I think it's a key thing I would mention.
Why was it important for you to create testing technology for HR and hiring?
No, I mean, I guess why it was important was that it was important for me and the company I worked for. So I guess to create the testing technology, I guess I did first and foremost because I saw the need myself where I was working, for example, at Ericsson and at Boeing. And then when I started to create a test solution, I saw a possibility to also introduce it to other companies and allow them to use that very same tool. Well, one thing is that it's very important to hire the best developers, but one thing to also push for when it comes to testing is that it's an unbiased, you can always argue if it's 100% unbiased, but it's very much unbiased if you compare to the other things that you do during a recruitment process, such as the interview with the recruiter or HR person or manager, where it's very, very hard to stay totally unbiased. I mean, after all, it's a person, and you're trying to assess if that person will do well on the job, and then you probably use your previous experience, and you assess the person a lot on if you like them and if you think others will like them, if they communicate well. And that might be, I think science also shows in many cases is a biased process. And it's even if you really, really want to not be biased, it's very hard to do it. Whereas a test is as unbiased as you can be, basically. It doesn't care of your background or other things. It just tests that's very skill that you want to test.
I like that, because I think that just because you're a good interviewer doesn't make you a good developer.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, and you have many interviewers who don't work with development themselves, and then they usually feel it's a really nice comfort to have a test to rely on as well.
What are maybe some other ways that you're seeing in your experience where we are hiring more tech-centric roles? What are we missing? You've identified and built this technology to help with assessing technical talent. Are there any other areas of hiring high-tech workers that you feel like recruiters need to update or enhance or just make the experience better?
Yeah, I guess sometimes it can be that the process goes too fast. I mean, you try to be fast when you think you have a good candidate, and sometimes that can lead you to take decisions too quickly, or to be not doing all the sound checks that you should do, for example, checking references or testing that we talked a lot about, due to the lack of candidates. So that's one thing, I guess. And then, like I just talked about, objectivity is one thing that could easily go missing. I mean, I think the problem is also that if you have a really likable person, and they might not be the best developer, if you hire them, most likely you'll find a way for them to stay at the company, maybe doing a different role than what you were recruiting for initially, which might in some cases be good, but in some cases it's not really the desired outcome. That a year later they're working as a project manager or manager or something else. So yeah, so I guess that sometimes can go too quickly, and the objectivity side might be two things that could go wrong.
Actually, this morning, it's funny that we're recording the podcast, because I stumbled upon an experience on Airbnb. I used them last week for a trip to the beach. And there is a consulting company that is actually offering interview testing and practice for engineers and developers in Seattle for Amazon. It's almost $5,000 US you pay, and it's like a 2-day intensive where you go and get prepped for the interview. Have you experienced or seen any of those type of coachings and trainings in your work?
Not really. I think I'm based in Sweden, and probably like the US and Seattle are, like London, more mature. They come further basically in the tech recruiting field. So even though I try to, of course, stay on top of my field, I haven't come across those kind of 2-day efforts. No, that's new to me actually, but it sounds very interesting. Yeah.
I'll link to the Airbnb experience in the transcript of this podcast. I just thought that this made your case for having an unbiased, objective coding assessment even more important, because candidates can be coached and trained, and they're spending big dollars. $5,000 is a lot of money to put behind to make sure that your interview at a leading tech company goes smoothly.
Yeah, no, I've seen books that are in the same area, but not that kind of longer course or so. That's new to me. A very interesting thing. But I mean, I think what we see if we look at the results of our tests is that I think the best way to prepare for these tests is to actually have a long experience in development. So maybe you had a really big interest in development even before starting university, or you really focused a lot on programming during the university, then usually you get really good results in the tests, and you'll also do well in the position that you're later hired in. So I think that's the most sound way to be hired, to be really good at your job, basically. And then just talking about when you mentioned this 48-hour thing, I was thinking also about another angle of this is that some companies use tests that have been developed in-house. And then there is one tricky thing actually when developing a test is that it's hard to make it short enough and still give a relevant result. So it's easier actually to make a test that is some kind of work task that you have where you are, and you think that that's a suitable test. But then the problem might be that it takes many hours to actually complete it, maybe even a weekend. And then you have the risk of losing good candidates because they don't want to spend so many hours on just doing a test task, and they're not getting paid for it typically. So yeah, that's also a risk if you make too lengthy a test.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the WORKOLOGY podcast sponsored by Clear Company. Today we're talking about global recruiting trends in the technology sector with Henrik Enstrom.
Podcast support provided by Clear Company. Clear Company is a complete talent management platform used by human resources professionals to help them hire, retain, and engage A players with ease. Visit clearcompany.com to sign up for a free personalized demo.
Hiring remote workers is becoming more common, and we're becoming more dispersed and more global. And I mentioned that companies are expanding into other markets at the beginning of the podcast. Should we be screening remote engineers for different characteristics or skills other than just technical coding?
I mean, one thing to acknowledge is that working remotely, having remote teams is a tricky thing in itself, and doing recruitment remotely is also tricky, of course, because it's a much more lengthy process. It's tricky. Will you actually meet the candidate? Maybe you do some first screening and then they travel, because you probably want to meet them before you hire them. And also the screening can be tricky because you're in a different location. So, I mean, one point with our tool is that it's web-based. You would go to futureskill.com and send them a test, and they take it online in their own web browser. So I guess what I can say about that is that you can select a few candidates that do well on tests and then proceed with them. And maybe you will have just a few candidates that either travel to you so you can meet them for a regular interview, or that you otherwise focus on a fewer number of people. But otherwise, what you're screening for, I think, is the same thing. You want really great developers. You want people who are good in communication and good at working together. And then, of course, in the end, if you work with a remote team, it will always be very tricky. It will always take more time to complete the project when you have teams in different locations. That's no matter how good people you have.
I'm also interested in gamification of screening and testing technologies. I feel like the idea of gamification was really hot. I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. It's kind of died down, maybe because they're more embedded in the different assessments and technology that we're currently using. Can you talk a bit about how maybe you've developed these skills of competitive challenges inside of FutureSkill and why they matter?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few different points here. So when we talk about challenges, it's different to a test. I mean, a test, you have a given task that you have a time limit for, and you send it as a personal link, and then you get a test report out of that, so you can see if the person solved it correctly or not. Whereas the challenges, they're more open, so anyone can enter via the URL. They're competing against the other people who go into the competition, and there is no correct solution like in the tests. So it's basically some task, like you might steer a tank or a spaceship shooting aliens, and you want to do that as good as possible, as efficiently as possible, and then you end up hopefully at the top of the top list. So it's a very different experience, and it's much more made to be like a fun experience, more like a game actually. But you're not playing it with a normal controller. Instead, you're using a code to control, for example, the spaceship. And for the company, then it's a good way to reach passive talents. So we know all too well that we have a lot of good people that don't want to apply for jobs. They see no need. People should contact them. But to solve a coding challenge and compete with others, that's fun, and you might involve your friends. And then you're actually, as a company, you're doing something for the developer. And it's a way to, so they're much more likely basically to go in and take a challenge than they are to apply for a job. And it's also twofold, that you both reach those passive talents and you help your employer brand by doing something nice, but also there is a built-in code test. So those that do well, you will know basically from the get-go that they are good developers as well. So I think it's a really clever way to introduce coding online into the recruitment process, and also build your employer brand.
I love this idea because it's such a great way to kind of assess people, and they have fun at the same time, and then they want to make it a fun environment with friends and colleagues to come and join and participate in the challenge itself. How are you seeing your clients invite individuals to the challenge? I mean, is it just something where you send it out to a large group, or are they working with different organizations or communities, or is it just sort of organic online?
I've seen different versions of it. We've done some more like hackathons where you have a group of close-knit developers, maybe 25 people, and they see this as a really fun thing to do together. Some cases they do it individually during a lunch break. You have like 1 hour or 2 hours. Sometimes they compete in teams, and sometimes it goes on for a few weeks until you decide who the winner is. So that's like the internal thing, that you do it like a more fun way to challenge each other at the workplace. But then also we run these like larger ones where companies try to they basically send it out on LinkedIn and Facebook and other social channels, and try to get as many people as possible in their geographical area to enter and take that challenge. And then of course it's more like a marketing effort to reach out and get people in there.
I love it. We recently did a podcast interview where we talked about Reddit as a great sourcing and engagement platform. I think that your coding challenge could be carefully, of course, promoted through a site like Reddit, where I feel like a lot of people who aren't on traditional social networks like LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook, or even GitHub, are engaging and having conversations. So you could really find some of those hidden gems doing these coding challenges that way.
Yeah, I agree. And the more different challenges spread it in, like for example Reddit, I think would be ideal. And in some cases they also spread more, I don't know, I wouldn't say virally, but more that someone tips off people on, for example, Reddit or similar pages, and it spreads a bit more organically sometimes, those challenges. So, and also what we're doing now, actually, we're rolling out kind of an update to our page where candidates, where developers can actually create their own challenges. So they can define the challenge directly in the web page and send it to their friends, and have them code and solve their game or task or whatever they do.
I love that. I think that's such a great crowdsource way to work with the community of developers and coders and encourage kind of that viral component too.
Yeah. So it's all about being creative, and I guess we're giving the platform for it, and then it's about how wild or good your ideas are after that.
Awesome. Well, Henrik, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Where can people go to learn more about you and what you're doing with coding and testing and assessment?
Yeah, I would say futureskill.com is the place to start, and yeah, we tell a little bit about our story, and you can go in and take challenges, even create challenges soon, and read more about us.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to futureskill.com on the transcript of the podcast, and we will also include a link to your LinkedIn profile as well for individuals that want to connect with you directly too. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Our whole industry is evolving so quickly, but it's amplified in the technology sector and in recruiting those tech employees. We have to move quickly to make an offer or risk losing the candidate, but we also have to make sure that we're making offers to the candidate with the best validated skill sets. Validated is key. And as this is happening, we're hiring more and more people outside of our region or country, which presents another set of challenges. It's fascinating to learn about technologies that can help us adapt to these changes and save our recruiting time and budget. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.